Walking into the plenary hall of Stockholmsmässan in Sweden, we didn't really know whether or not we had to bow to the King of Sweden. My furtive eyes glanced at him, seated next to the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres. My Mauritian flag pinned to the flap of my suit, I couldn't feel any prouder to represent my country, because I knew, or at least I thought, that we, as youngsters from small island developing states, needed to be represented no matter what, because we would be the ones to face the consequences of the climate crisis the most. The camera flashes of the media were blinding, and the ceremony began on Vivaldi's Fourth Season, played by a wonderful Philharmonic Orchestra. As we walked to gain our seats, our hearts were beating very hard, and the only thing we could think about is how proud we were. Though, in all that, in all those emotions, one single thing, remained at the back of my mind. Is it all a masquerade? Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. I am Mathieu Lacruz, a student at UWC East Africa in Moshi. I have had the honor and privilege to be accredited as youth representative to several UN conferences around the world. The first one being Pre-COP26, Youth for Climate, in 2021. Then I got into Stockholm Plus 50 in Sweden, an international meeting convened by the UN. I have been accredited to COE 17, which is part of COP27, and COE 18 currently, which is part of COP 28. I also serve as head of environment education for UN Environment Program's youth constituency. Anyway, enough about me. I think that by making this TED Talk, I might not necessarily get accredited to many UN conferences in the near future, but I do think that there is a truth that needs to be voiced, and that many young activists around the world needs to be heard just like I will. By making this TED Talk, I also realized how hard it can be sometimes by working through all these UN processes. However, this is a necessary thing. That being said, let us understand how it all started. So how the UN and different international organizations started this youth engagement. So in 2002, at COP, so the global yearly international meeting on climate change, they decided that there would be the first conference of youth. Nearly 10 years later, in 2013, the UN Secretary General, then Ban Ki-moon, stated that he would have his first ever envoy on youth. This was a major milestone in ensuring that we, as young people, would be represented at this highest level. An additional 10 years later, the UN General Assembly, so last year in 2022, voted on the first ever UN Youth Office. Though, in all this, why only now? Why now? Because I think that the youth has always been involved in these societal combats, in making their revendications heard. So why does it happen only over the past 20 years? You know, the youth were at the center of many combats, as I've said. They were the ones desegregating schools in the Jim Crow South. They were the ones marching on Selma Bridge with Martin Luther King. In the 60s, the SDS in the United States, the Students for a Democratic Society, they were the ones fighting against the war in Vietnam, and they were a key element in that fight. More recently, 1989, not so much I know, in China, Tiananmen Square, the youth were the ones taking down the streets, marching, protesting for actual institutional democratic reforms in China. In 2010, the Arab Spring, Chloe Meldrake from Boston University stated the Arab Spring could never have happened without a numerical and ideological push from a huge mass of angry youth. So as I've said, why only now? Youth consultations are meant to be fundamentally listening to the youth, including them in decision-making processes, and acting upon this advice. However, I think that this is being used by some international organizations. To justify my thought, let us rewind to this conference in Sweden. So while the world had its eyes on Sweden, commemorating 50 years of climate negotiations, by the way, we all thought that it was now time for action. I love this. Every COP, the same thing, now time for action. Yet, we're waiting. Well, as the world had its eyes on Sweden, something felt odd. It didn't feel normal. It felt like a team of meticulous, extremely good at their job, communications experts had gathered and agreed that the youth would be placed in the center of this conference. Why? Because what's better than the youth to represent a sustainable future? So they did. The youth was funded and participated to this conference, including me. So don't get me wrong, I don't think that we should stop all collaborations with the UN or international organizations in general, and that we should just move on. It would be counterproductive. However, I think that us, as young people, sometimes need to take a step back and think about how meaningful our contributions actually are. I am scared that these UN processes, by including the youth, are becoming the new trend, the new sexy term, the breath of fresh air in this extremely complexified, bureaucratic concepts. So, just to better understand, over the past few weeks, I allowed myself to a small activity. I would count how many links, so to conferences, to internships, to youth advisory boards. That's the new cool term, by the way, youth advisory boards. So how many of these links I would receive on average in a single week? It is 41. So over a year, I would receive over 3,000 links like that, asking us to participate in X, Y, or Z youth opportunity. I think that in all of this, where do we, as young people, find ourselves? I think that we are turning into a generation of careerists and opportunists who only focus on their personal success instead of fighting for our cause. Instead, we fight against each other all the time, recklessly, shamelessly, to be nominated to X, Y, or Z conference. We do not necessarily realize how others, just like us, might just be better at something else. In 2022 alone, the UN hosted some 461 international meetings and conferences. Why so many, you might ask? Well, I have no idea, but I am sure that this is definitely pleasing way more than one bureaucrat who, well, needs to justify his salary. I think, and I am scared, that the youth is being dragged into this process, this overly complexified process, just for the sake of it, and every ounce of our energy is being sucked out of us for the sake of this supposed youth engagement. So we should not tag along, we should not accept it. Despite the fact that we are being funded by them, we should understand that we are still able to question this process. So what should we do as young people in all this? I think we should go back to grassroots movements, where we focus on the field, where we take action, and we can see a tangible outcome out of it. We need to be able to unite and together fight for our convictions. To go further than that, I would say we need political engagement. Don't get me wrong, again, I don't think that the world needs more mini Trumps or mini Obamas. I don't mean politics in the partisan politics sense. I mean politics in its noble sense. To understand, politics comes from Greek, polites. That means citizens. So I think that as young people, we need to understand how politics is this bigger societal project that is just bigger than any of us. Hence, we need to understand how our efforts together can lead to actual change, how we, as young people, can be actors of meaningful change. I think that the youth needs to focus on their convictions, ideologies, and should push for their ideals always. Because, simple question, since when did we go from a generation that would fight for equal justice, that would fight with Martin Luther King on Selma Bridge, to a generation that would beg for accreditation and funding just to wear a nice suit at the conference? I don't know. Well, now it's up to us, young people, to decide how and when we want to lead our actions. I believe that I have tried through these processes to make something and to actually push for our causes. However, having tried, I think that I failed, because I don't have a single proposal paper that came out of these conferences of which I am proud of. So going back to these grassroots movements is really essential to making sure that we don't get stuck in this loop of conferences, being disappointed by the negative outcome, being frustrated, and going back again, because we really care for it, right? So it's really important that we understand how united we can have a very strong action, because this is way bigger than any of us. I would like to dedicate this speech to all my friends who are dedicating their lives to something much bigger than all of us, who are taking a stance when colonization, oppression, or genocide happens in this world. Thank you.